Hello there. Good to see you this evening or this morning, wherever you are. It's been a while. It was 2 weeks ago, I guess, tonight that we had our most recent class. It seems to me like it's been 2 months. There's been a lot going on in my life. I've done some traveling and unfortunately had a little bit of illness along the way, but recovered from that. Last week, you were looking for the 1 hour long substitute for this class, and unfortunately that didn't come out either. We were anticipating the possibility of streaming live a full hour assembly of the church where I was preaching the gospel, but the church decided to change the schedule, the meeting time. It's 7 o'clock in the evening here where we are, and I had anticipated those assemblies would start at 7, and they decided to start at 6 o'clock instead. So by 7, we were nearly finished every night, and it wasn't convenient for us to set up another class to start at 7 o'clock. So I had told you that if you didn't see us, it's because something didn't work out right. It wasn't technology this time. It was just the scheduling and decisions of people. But we had an excellent lesson, an excellent series of lessons, and those are all archived, or most of them are archived also on the YouTube channel, and you can go over there and have a look at that and see what you missed in that series of lessons that ran from Sunday through Wednesday. Turned out there were only 5 lessons in that series because, as I said, I did get sick, unfortunately, and missed the evening assembly. And I really hated to have to do that. I wrote to the church and told them I owe you a lesson, and so I'll go back someday perhaps and give them that lesson or another substitute for it that we missed on that occasion. But we're here tonight. We're here to resume our Confirming the Church's Bible class, and we are in the book of Acts, and we're in chapter number 1, and we'll resume that in just a moment. But I just wanted to thank you for tuning in and having a look at the class. And when you're all finished with this, or even for now, call people up or text them, email them, and tell them, hey, tune in and see what we've got here. And we'll be glad to share our time, our evening, and our study with as many people as are interested. I know we've got people from at least 2 different countries that are listening in tonight, in several of the states in the United States. And we're happy to have all of you with us. From time to time, if you would let people know that we're here every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, or at this time, whatever time it is where you are, 2300 UTC. If you're viewing in from any place else around the world, we will be here if the Lord wills. Now, last time we were here, we studied from about verse 15 through about verse 20 in Acts chapter 1, and when we were finished, we ran out of time last week. We were kind of right in the middle of Peter's speech and their process of replacing Judas, who had fallen. Let's back up to verse 15 and have a look at that and see where we were. Peter stood up, verse 15, in the midst of the disciples and said, and then Luke, who wrote the book, pauses here and tells us, now there were about 120 disciples gathered together at that time. So Peter is standing in the midst of the 120 disciples. I want us to watch closely from here through the end of the chapter and into the first few verses of the next chapter. Now watch who we're talking about. Be very careful, because many people get very confused here with the numbers of people and what happened to whom. It's not that difficult. If we'll watch closely what we're actually reading, we can see what the Lord has to say about it. Peter stood up and he was speaking, and you remember that he quoted from Psalm 41 in verse number 9 when he says the scripture must have been fulfilled that he should be replaced, or that he would fall, it would replace Jesus. And verse 17, he was numbered with us, had obtained a part of this ministry. He was sharing in the same service that Peter and all the other apostles were sharing. It's really sad that some people will look at examples like, for example, Judas or some others maybe in the New Testament, and they say, well, he fell away. He probably never was saved in the first place. Just simply doesn't hold water. Peter said he was one of us. He shared in this ministry. He was an equal apostle to all of the others. And then in verse 18, talks about how the money that they had given him was then used to purchase a burial field. And it was called, in verse 19, in the Aramaic language, Akeldama, which means the field of blood. And then he explains that too was prophesied in the Psalms. Peter says, it is written in the book of Psalms, let his habitation be desolate, and let no man dwell therein, and his bishopric let another take. That is his office as a bishop. The word bishop here is not quite the way that many people use the word bishop today. It means overseer. It technically means the same thing that most people understand, but doesn't refer to the same description of an office that men have invented since that time. The word bishop is equivalent to the word overseer, but it's also a synonym, or is used interchangeably with words like pastor and elder. Later on in the book of Acts and on throughout the New Testament. It just simply means one who was given the responsibility to oversee that which ultimately belonged to somebody else. Jesus is the head of the church. He promised, you remember in Acts 16, I will build my church. As we read all the way through the book of Acts and through the remainder of the New Testament, frankly, there's only one church. Yes, there were churches in every different city, but the church in Ephesus, the church in Athens, the church in Corinth, the church in Jerusalem, they were not different faiths. They didn't have different practices and different doctrines and different names. You wouldn't have to choose which church to attend if you went from one city to another. There was only one church in existence. They were all the same. Yeah, you read through the epistles to Ephesus and Colossae and Philippi and Thessalonica and the others, and you see, well, they all had different kinds of problems. They had different issues that had to be addressed. In fact, there are about a dozen such issues specifically identified in Paul's first epistle to the church in Corinth. They had a lot of trouble that they needed to have settled and fixed. They had a lot of issues of things they didn't understand, or things that they had understood and then had corrupted and were needing to get back to some of that. But they were the same church. They were all referred to as the church of the Lord, the church of God, the church of Christ, different terms. Interesting to note that no one single name was ever given to the church in the New Testament. But they were all the same church. They all had the same apostles. They all had the same head, the Lord Jesus. They all had the same description, that is, organization, with elders or overseers, pastors over each church. A pastor being the same as an elder or an overseer, not the preacher was a different person. They had deacons. They all had the same description. They all had the same function, the same responsibility in the world. Just one church. So when we see the word bishop here in Acts chapter 1, we've gotten a little far afield in discussing that. But we'll come through all of that. As we read through the book of Acts, we'll encounter these names and these offices again from time to time. And we'll probably take time to mention again the relationship between these words and the offices which they represent. So we were in verse 20. It is written in the book of Psalms, let his habitation be desolate, let no man let no man dwell therein, and his bishopric let another take. Let somebody else take his office. That was what the psalmist said. And then Peter goes on, and let's continue. We ended there last week, so let's pick up at this point and continue with our study. In verse number 21, wherefore, Peter says, of these men which have companied with us all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John unto that same day that he was taken up from us, must one be ordained to be a witness with us of his resurrection. Of these men that have companied with us, must one be ordained. Let's stop and talk just a little bit about this word ordained. That, again, is a word that has changed its meaning. over the years. It's used today most often in a way quite different from the way that it was used in the first century and the way it's used here. It just simply means designated, appointed, in a way that everybody would know. They're about to select somebody in the public. It's going to be in this group of 120 people, including the 11 apostles. And from that group of 120, of about 120 people, they are going to select one, and everybody there is going to see that the Lord made the selection and that it's His choice. There was no special ceremony. There was no special speech that had to be made. There was no kind of anointing or pouring some kind of oil or making some kind of mark on some individual. None of that is here. It just simply means I pick you. One that's designated and chosen to fill this particular task. So that's what we're looking at in verse number 21. So from these men, from which men? Well, it had to be one. Here's the qualifications for an apostle are listed right here. Have you noticed that? He had to be somebody who was with the apostles and Jesus from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, from the time he was baptized by John until the time that we saw him ascend up into heaven, or at least until the time that he died, and then be a witness of his resurrection. It had to be somebody who had been with them all that time. So when we read through the life of Christ, or we read the apostles were here and some of his disciples were there, sometimes those words are used interchangeably, apostle and disciple. Sometimes the word apostle in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, simply refers to the 12 specifically. The word apostle refers to the 12 specifically. Sometimes the word disciple refers to those 12 only, and sometimes it refers to all the others, and it's not always possible to know which. But it's interesting to know that that there were others besides just the 12 who were there with Jesus. Maybe not every minute of every day. The 12 weren't. On one occasion, Jesus sent the 12 out to go into all the cities of Israel. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they were with Jesus every minute of every day, but they were with him throughout his ministry. They heard what he said. They saw what he did. They saw the effect of his life on other people around. They saw his crucifixion. They saw his burial. They saw his resurrection. They saw didn't see him come out of the tomb, but they saw the resurrected Lord. So there were others beside just those 12. And then in verse 22, one must be ordained to be a witness with us of his resurrection. Well, he's already resurrected. We're not going to watch him come out of the tomb. That's not what Peter's talking about. Be a witness of his resurrection. No, it means be someone who gives testimony, someone who gives credible record of here's what I know, here's what I saw, here's what I heard. John later would write, we saw him, we heard him, we touched him, our hands handled him. This is first-hand evidence, as if we were in a court of law. These people were going to be giving their testimony. I know, I was there, I saw it, I'm telling you what the facts of the case are. We needed people who knew that. We needed people who saw Jesus before his crucifixion, saw him crucified. We need people, then the same people who saw him raised from the dead, alive again. And they went out telling that message all over the world. That's what the book of Acts is. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they tell us about the ministry of Jesus, the teaching, the miracles, as Luke says here in the book of Acts, of all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. So they saw all that and they did all that. And then the book of, if you notice in most of our copies of the Bible, we look at the book of Acts, the full title is something like the Acts of the Apostles. Tell us what those apostles then did after the life of Jesus. And we talked about that in the first class in this series. And if you missed that, you can go back here on Google Plus or on the YouTube channel, and you can find those classes and catch up to where we are today. We talked about the background of the book of Acts and the reasons that we're studying this particular book. So here we've got the apostles and the other Christians, the other not Christians yet, but disciples or followers of Jesus. They're not called Christians for quite some time, and we'll come across that. Actually, in chapter 11 is the first time the word is used. But we'll see how they became Christians and what they did. But anyway, they were all together here, and they're talking about replacing Judas. And in the process of replacing him, or discussing the replacing of him, they talk about the qualifications of one who is going to be an apostle of Jesus. And he had to be somebody who was with them from the beginning. And he had to be able to give testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. You see, the whole effect of the gospel, or the believability, the credibility of the gospel, when they would go out preaching, you need to follow Jesus. Well, why would I believe that? Because he rose from the dead. If you've got just a minute, you might want to turn over to chapter 17. If you can kind of hold your finger in one place and flip to another, look at verses 30 and 31. God has appointed a day of judgment, and he has given proof of that fact. How? By raising Jesus from the dead. You see, the resurrection of Jesus is evidence that everything else about him was true. That he said he came from heaven. Well, he did. I mean, he proved his power. He proved his trustworthiness to be believed simply in that he rose from the dead. Nobody ever did that before. You know, nearly 100 years ago, 75 years ago now, I guess. The famous magician Houdini said, I'm going to come back from the grave. Well, if he could have done that, we would believe that the guy really was a magician, that he really was able to, to understand things and do things and be, a special kind of a person that we really ought to stand in awe of. Well, he never did that, and he never will. Nobody else ever did. But the Son of God did come back from the dead. That's what makes his message so believable and so worthy of our focus and our attention. So we're trying to replace Judas. We need to select a man who can be a witness with us of his resurrection. A couple of things we need to comment on still before we leave this verse. Number one, the idea of being a witness. People today call themselves witnesses. I was sitting in an assembly just a few days ago, Saturday afternoon it was, and a man talked about we are witnesses for Jesus. Well, nobody today is. We are not witnesses. We did not see him. We didn't see him before he was crucified. We didn't see him on the cross. We didn't see him in the tomb. We didn't see him come out of the tomb. We didn't see him walking around after the tomb, and we did not watch while he went up into the clouds. Nobody today is a witness of Jesus. There's a whole religion that calls themselves witnesses. We're not witnesses. If we're going to put our role somehow in that court structure, we're not the people on the stand giving testimony. We cannot give credible testimony. If we were called into a literal court today, so we're going to try and find out whether this Jesus is really who he claimed to be, they couldn't call us to give witness or to give evidence of his life, his teaching, his miracles, or his resurrection and ascension. We weren't there. They would tell us, well, you're not qualified. You're not a witness. You can't do that. We're not witnesses. Do we stand anywhere in that court structure? Well, we're not the judges. God's a judge of everybody. I guess the world has to judge the credibility of the message. But we who know the message are not the judges. Let's see, we're not the attorneys maybe arguing the case, defending the witness. You might possibly put it in that context. But it seems to me that the better record here, or better position here would be that of court reporter. We're simply the people who are telling what evidence has been presented. The court record is here. We're simply passing it on. We're telling what the judge has decided on the matters of our spiritual conditions and whatever, the truth of who Jesus was and what his will for us is and all of that. The testimony is in the book. The apostles gave the witness. And now one other thing, while we're still in this in this same thing, a witness in this verse 22, a witness with us. Who's us? Is it the apostles? Is it all of the 120? It's not the 120. And I can show you that in the next verse. Remember, I told you a couple of weeks ago, earlier on, as we were in the same chapter, I told you, watch the pronouns and watch the flow of the grammar. That's going to be very important from here into the second chapter. Let's watch the next verse, 23. And they appointed two, Joseph, called Barsabas, who was surnamed Justus, and Matthias. So now we've got 120 disciples here. From this 120, we need to pick one. And he needs to be somebody who was with Jesus from the beginning and is an eyewitness of his resurrection. And out of that 120, okay, take out the 11. So what have you got left? My math is no good. About 109. So you got 109 people standing there. And out of that 109 people, they found two who were with Jesus from the beginning and eyewitnesses of his resurrection. So the us here is not the 120. They were not all eyewitnesses. They did not qualify. Yeah, we know Jesus. We understood it. You know, we're going to find out here very soon that his brothers, the brothers of Jesus, were included amongst the believers, amongst the disciples. But 6 months before his crucifixion, they didn't believe in him. They weren't followers of him. So there were people by this time, after his resurrection, and rapidly to come now in the next few hours and days, a great number more will become believers who may have seen Jesus, who may have heard him once or twice through the course of his 3.5 or so years of his preaching and travels. But they didn't follow with him all the way. Out of these 109 people, they found only two. So when he says witnesses with us, he's not talking about every believer here. That simply doesn't fit the grammar. It's not a possible interpretation or understanding of this verse. So they found two. There was one called Joseph and another called Matthias. And Joseph had three names, Barsabas, and his surname was Justus. We got Joseph, we got Matthias. And they prayed, and they said, now here's what they prayed, verse number 24. They said, Lord, you know the hearts of all men. Show which of these two you have chosen, that he may take part of this ministry and this apostleship, from which Judas by transgression fell, that he might go to his own place. Well, that's a short prayer. You know, prayers don't have to be long all the time. And getting into you know, everything that a person might think or might want to say to God all at the same time. But look at verse number 25. Judas had to be replaced. Why? Because he fell by transgression. It's possible then for someone who holds a high office in the service of Jesus Christ to lose that office, to lose that relationship with Christ, that position. And notice also here how Judas fell. He fell by transgression. What's transgression? Transgression. The word transgression means going beyond. To transgress is to go beyond, to cross over the line, as it were. The line of what? Well, the line of authority of God, the line of what God requires of people. John tells us that sin is transgression of the law. So what Judas did was he transgressed. He went outside the will of Christ. That's a sin. Right here in the first chapter of Acts, the Lord says it's a lie to say that a Christian cannot sin and cannot lose his position with Christ. Judas did. We see that before we ever come to the book of Acts, yet in the life of Jesus. After that Last Supper, Judas went out to the priests and the scribes and the Pharisees and agreed with them to betray Jesus over in the Garden of Gethsemane. And they gave him a certain amount of money, and he went and led them to Jesus, and they arrested him there. Please don't let anybody ever tell you that it's not possible for a Christian to sin. Somebody will say, well, you sinned, you must not have been a faithful Christian in the first place. That's simply not the truth. Judas sinned, Any one of us can. That's what the entire New Testament is written for, at least everything after the book of Acts, to encourage people not to sin, but to stand faithful with Jesus Christ. Let's see if we can finish this chapter before time runs out this evening, and then we can pick up next week. Verses 24 and 25, they pray to the Lord, Lord, you show us which one you choose. You know, Jesus chose the original 12. They were his hand-picked people. He looked over all of his disciples, all of his followers at that time, and he picked 12, and he called them apostles, a word which means someone who is sent. He specifically designated them to be his representatives, to be sent to other people, sent from the Lord to the world to preach the gospel, to preach the good news of salvation. So, Lord, you show which one of these you wish us to have. How's he going to show? Is he going to boom a voice out of heaven? Is he going to reach an arm out of heaven and stick his finger right out there and say, I want that one? No, he's not going to do that. That's not what the record says. What they did was they gave forth their lots, verse 26, and the lot fell upon Matthias. Some kind of voting procedure. I don't know, they might have thrown down sticks and see which ones turn which direction. Sometimes it's referred to as casting dice, although they probably didn't have anything in those days like the dice that we would recognize today. Sometimes they would maybe draw straws or something like that. Any kind of way of making selections. Probably what happened here was they all voted. I choose this one, I choose that one, and that vote was directed by God. However they did it, whatever the process was, it was guided by the Lord to show his selection, and the choice was Matthias. Now notice verse 26, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. I'll give you just a quick hint or preview of next week's lesson. Remember that this book was written without chapter breaks, without verse breaks. There weren't any numbers stuck in here. We didn't have a verse 25, a verse 26, a chapter 2, a verse 1. Those weren't originally written here. He was numbered with the 11, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. Who's the they in verse 1 of Acts chapter 2? Well, it's the 11. In context, we're talking from the English translation here, but in the English language, the grammatical structure here is that what happens in the next few verses happens to the 12, Matthias and the original 11, and not to the 120. That is simply not possible with the grammar that we have before us. Well, our time is about finished for today. I really do appreciate your coming on board and joining us in this study, and look forward to you being with us again next time. Remember, these lessons will be archived just a few minutes after we finish here. This lesson will be on Google+. It'll be on my YouTube channel. You can look over there and find that. Some of you are viewing on YouTube right now, and it'll be right there where you are. You can find all the past lessons in this series. Encourage other people to tune in and watch us next time, and God will bless you for that, and I certainly will be thankful myself. And I pray that God will bless you as you continue to study the Bible, as you continue to give God your attention and your service according to his word. God gave us a book for a reason, so that we could know and understand him, so that we could know his will for our life. Why do we care about what God's will is for our life? Because God is our creator. We're taking a few things for granted here. We're studying only the book of Acts. We're not trying to dig into every fact and detail of the whole Bible. But God is our creator, and God is our eternal judge. When we leave this world, either through natural death, or if we're here alive when Jesus comes again and he takes us up with the angels to heaven, to judgment day, we're going to stand and be judged by the word of God. We need to know what he said. We need to know what his will is for us in this world. And we need to be sure that we are doing our very best to live according to what he wants us to do. So encourage others to come and to join us in these studies. And then please keep on studying the Bible yourself. Keep on praying and keep on serving God according to his book. Thanks once again for joining us this week, and may God bless you until next time.